James Edward O'Brien is a British journalist, television presenter, radio presenter, and podcaster. He's one of the presenters, as many of you know, on the talk station LBC, presenting on weekdays between 10 and 1 p.m., hosting a phone-in discussion on current affairs, real-life events, news and views. He hosts a weekly interview series with Joe entitled Unfiltered with James O'Brien, and he has occasionally presented Newsnight for the BBC. I'll have a bet with any of you that Brexit may or may not come up in the next few minutes. Please join me in welcoming our keynote addresser, Mr. James O'Brien.
I think that's the first time I've heard my radio programme described as emblematic of hopelessness in society. But we'll take whatever compliments we can. I'm a little embarrassed to be here this evening, to be honest with you, because the notion of social justice is one which is almost certainly better promoted by actions than words. And having been on a crash course in what Who Is Hussein do and represent, and indeed on the man who inspires them, I'm minded to point out that most of the people behind the organisation and most of the people behind us being here this evening already do rather more actions than a gob on a stick like me does. I specialise mostly in words. And it is, of course, actions that speak so much louder than words, but I'm going to have to stick initially at least to my field of expertise, or alleged expertise, which is words. And the two words at the centre of this evening's proceedings are social and justice. I'm not sure I'd heard the phrase social justice until relatively recently. And somewhat typically of the zeitgeist, somewhat typically of the strange period of history that we seem to be living through, I think it first reached my ears as a pejorative, as a negative, because there's a word you're supposed to stick on the end of social justice, which entitles you and somehow enables you to undermine the sincerity or the good intentions of people who believe, like everybody involved in Who Is Hussein, and presumably everybody here tonight, and presumably every decent person on the planet, social justice should be self-evident. But when you add the word warrior to the end of the phrase, the social justice warrior, or the SJW, it has become an insult. It's become a phrase that is used to mock the idea that some people believe in helping those less fortunate than themselves. It's become a phrase that has been offered up as evidence that anybody who stands up in public and claims to want a better life for someone other than themselves must be fraudulent, must be hypocritical, must be a social justice warrior. So I started thinking about the words, and I started thinking about other words that have been similarly corrupted. And the more I thought about these words, the more I wondered whether actually there's a uniting theme here in the, what would you call it? I suppose you'd call it the adversity to social justice, the idea that some people want to undermine efforts to do the right thing, to be helpful. And I was sort of thinking about this for the last couple of weeks, and then I was reading the Financial Times magazine this morning. I like to read the Financial Times on a Saturday because I like to remind myself that there are people in the world who can spend £15,000 on a toaster. It's a very glossy supplement. But the column at the front of it this morning looked at liberal resistance. And liberal, again, is one of those words that is very, very hard, increasingly hard to pin down. And, of course, crikey, there is a theme emerging here. I can't believe it. Liberal is also a word that has been turned into an insult, that has been turned into a pejorative, as if there's something somehow suspect about believing in fundamental freedoms. But what this piece in the Financial Times pointed out was something that I suspect people who have both feet in the West historically don't really understand. I suspect that if you have family and heritage in the Middle East, it's probably rather easier to appreciate. But we have a tendency, I think, in this country, and also very pertinently at the moment in America, to think that an oppressive regime or an authoritarian regime, a populist but oppressive government won't last very long. We think as Europeans of perhaps Mussolini or Franco or Hitler, and we think of their window of power as being vanishingly small, and one which ultimately, and in every single case I've just cited, was closed quite quickly by the forces of liberalism, or, if you think about it, by the forces of social justice. And it's not true, actually, as you see Viktor Orban in Hungary consolidating power and espousing profoundly Islamophobic and anti-Semitic tropes, and somewhat more worryingly, sending a letter of gratitude to Conservative MPs last week for propping him up in Parliament when every single other Western government had issued a very, very strong condemnation of his assaults upon the rule of law and freedoms. That would be British Conservative MEPs. And I said I wasn't going to get political tonight, sorry, but we are where we are. So these regimes don't necessarily disappear in the blink of an eye. They don't necessarily buckle under the forces of liberalism or social justice. If you look at European history, you will see, up until 1848 really, when the revolutions began to sweep continental Europe, that actually deeply authoritarian, deeply oppressive regimes were commonplace. And the strange role of the liberal is the urban liberal, if you like, perhaps the metropolitan elite, to coin another phrase that has been turned into a pejorative. Essentially, it means someone brilliant who lives in a city. But of course, in the hands of Brexiters and Donald Trump fans and sundry other half-wits, metropolitan elite has become an insult. Don't try to be brilliant, whatever you do, and don't live in a city. Sound advice. So you look at what these liberals did in places pre-1848 in Europe, and you look, as this column rather brilliantly pointed out, you look at apartheid-era South Africa, and you see urban liberals who are actually thriving under an oppressive regime, but congratulate themselves on occasionally criticizing it, on offering up clever newspaper articles about how awful everything is. You see it today in China and Russia. But it was the mention of South Africa that particularly resonated with me. The line that Simon Cooper wrote this morning in the Financial Times was something like, urban liberals sat around their swimming pools mocking the government that privileged them while black maids served cake. It's a surprisingly sustainable way of life, as long as we feel we've somehow vented our spleen, we've declared our virtue. Oh, there's another one, virtue signalling, as if somehow being proud of doing the right thing is something that you should be ashamed of. They've managed to turn virtue signalling into a pejorative, into an insult, just like social justice warrior, just like liberal. And if you do live quietly but complainingly under these regimes, you're complicit in them. And because South Africa was mentioned in this article, and because I had heard of Hussein before I was invited to be here tonight, but I hadn't joined the dots. The dots are quite easily joined, because the first I heard of Hussein was when I was reading Nelson Mandela's autobiography, The Long Road to Freedom, in which he talks of one night in Robben Island when he was close to surrendering. He was close to giving up his cause, his anti-apartheid campaigning. He was facing, after I think some 20 years already in jail, a crisis of conscience and a crisis of confidence. And he read the writings, the words of Hussein, and found the strength within himself to reject the government's invitation to sign a declaration of defeat or surrender, and determined instead to carry on resisting and to carry on fighting. So I had heard of Hussein. I remembered the line in Mandela's book, and I didn't, you'll forgive me for this, I don't imagine anybody else would have done it either, but I didn't go off and undertake a huge amount of research. But I did return to Mandela and learn also that Hussein inspired Mahatma Gandhi. So if you look at two figures from recent history, two names that resonate still throughout the world, and you learn, because you've had the privilege of being asked to an event like this evening, that they both cited Hussein as a shining example of the life well lived and the ultimate sacrifice ultimately made. You realize that there is something here that can reach over 1,400 years of history and provide a personal example, curiously detached actually from both politics and religion, and focused instead upon the fundamental goodness, bravery and dignity of one individual whose example we can follow. It resonated with me. And then, of course, as I continued to try to make a list of words that have somehow had their meanings changed in recent years, I realized, and I think I've got this right, I'm sure Ali will correct my history if I've got it wrong, but I realized that Hussein and the 75 people who fled with him was actually an asylum seeker. He might have been a grandson of the prophet, he might have been a very wealthy and powerful man, but he was, when he fled an oppressive regime after refusing to pledge allegiance to it, he was actually, and he became immediately, a seeker of asylum. Another phrase that in Britain in 2018 has become a pejorative, a negative, an insult. And who provides asylum? Social justice warriors. And what do they do when they've done it? Oh, they virtue signal. And what do we call all of these people who think that somehow doing the right thing by your fellow man and woman is the right thing to do? We call them liberals. We call them lefties. So let's think about some other words that perhaps fall into this paradigm that I'm trying to describe this evening, this curious place we've arrived at, where not only is it acceptable to mock and vilify and insult people like the Who is Hussein organization for daring to try to do what is right, but also somehow to question their very sincerity, to question their integrity, to try to turn things that should be fundamental goods into bads. So that phrase virtue signal struck me, and then oddly I realized they've done the same thing to health and safety. If you read right-wing newspapers, health and safety has become a byword for government interference, for the nanny state, as if somehow there's something wrong in promoting health and safety. And we've allowed this to happen and we haven't actually noticed. It's that old analogy of boiling a frog, which I'm assured by veterinarians and biologists isn't actually true. But the old metaphor is that if you put a frog in water and turn the heat up very, very, very slowly, the frog will die without noticing because the heat increases at such an incremental rate that by the time it's too late for the frog to hop out of the pot, it's too late for the frog full stop. And that seems to be what's happened to public discourse in Western society at the moment, because asylum seeker shouldn't be a dirty word. Health and safety? How have we ended up living in a place where people get paid £1 million a year to write newspaper columns, telling their readers that there should be less health and less safety in their lives? If you think I'm exaggerating, try another phrase that's very common and very, very intrinsically linked to social justice. And you've read these articles, you've seen these people on your television, you've heard this two-word phrase used as a pejorative, as an insult. You've heard this phrase used as something that we should all be opposed to, something that we should feel infringes upon us or unfairly promotes the undeserving. It's a phrase you've probably heard 100 times already this month, depending on where you hang out, I suppose. If you read the Daily Mail, you've probably heard it 1,000 times. But the phrase is, and think about this, human rights. Now, theoretically, the only people who should be opposed to human rights are people who've decided that they're not human. And the only people who should be opposed to rights for any creature are people who despise freedom, people who embrace oppression, people who are precisely the same people who have turned asylum seeker or virtue signalling or health and safety or liberal into pejoratives, into dirty words. And we watch it happen every day. And it's only, for someone who talks for a living, I've only relatively recently noticed how debased we've allowed these phrases to become. Multicultural is another one, actually. Multicultural has become a dirty word. Multicultural has become something that right-wing commentators routinely tell us is not to be desired. So what I sometimes do is I find myself thinking, what's the opposite of this bad thing that you're telling me about? What's the opposite of multicultural? Monocultural. Monochrome. For Oasis fans among you, monobrow. Mono is not good. One flavour in life is not a choice any of us would make with open minds and open eyes. Multicoloured is better than black and white. We know all of this, and yet all these phrases, asylum seeker, human rights, virtue signalling, health and safety, liberal, multicultural, they've all become negatives. And so has social justice. Because anybody who speaks up for it automatically becomes a social justice, warrior. So why do what is right? Why try to live the good life? Why try to do the right thing? Why try at all to seek to recognize? Because most of the time we won't succeed. Most of the time we will fall short, we'll be found wanting. But why even try to do the right thing? And this is, it's the hardest lesson humanity has ever faced, that the encouragement of altruism, the idea of selflessness, and again, by essentially embracing death rather than embracing compromise and surrender. Hussein's example here shines through the centuries. But we are not him, and we are not, there may be some exceptions in this room, but we will not have that strength. We will not lay down our lives to make a point or to fulfill a principle or to resist oppression. What can we do? What can we do? And again, you find yourself greeted with almost a cavalcade of criticism when you suggest doing anything at all. During the refugee crisis, anybody who suggested, for example, that they wanted to see the government do more, anyone who felt a degree of embarrassment that the fourth, at the time, so it was before the Brexit vote, the fourth richest economy in the world was doing less than almost any other country in Europe to embrace the people fleeing the wars that we'd essentially started and failed to finish. Anybody who suggested that refugees should perhaps be provided with a warmer welcome was told that they were complete hypocrites because you haven't got any refugees in your spare bedroom. And it works. This insane rhetoric works. People sort of hear it and think they've actually made a good point. As a radio phone-in host, I spend my life dealing with people who speak almost undiluted hogwash and then sit back and pat themselves on the back for saying something brilliant. Oh, yeah, well, you haven't got a refugee in your bedroom, have you? So you're not allowed to approve of refugees. Mate, I would quite like to see my taxes go to the NHS, but I'm not going to start doing open heart surgery in my kitchen. It's a fairly straightforward relationship. So why, if you're not blessed with an altruistic outlook, and I think there is a danger. I understand what they mean when they use the phrase virtue signaling. This notion of walking the walk, or beg your pardon, talking the talk but not walking the walk. The idea that actions do speak much louder than words. How can you communicate to people who use phrases like asylum seeker as a negative, human rights as a pejorative, multicultural as a negative, virtue signaling as something to be embarrassed about or ashamed of, health and safety as a bad thing? I wonder, increasingly, as I get older, and I'm feeling very old tonight. I had no idea when I accepted this information just what a youthful organization and what a youthful bunch of trustees ran Who is Hussein. So I'd like to thank a significant portion of the audience for being very old. Thank you. Or at least older than me. That's comforted me enormously this evening. So how do you communicate to people the message that if we could all just be a bit nicer to each other, or in the words of those great cultural philosophers, Bill and Ted, if we could all just be excellent to each other, then life would actually get better for all of us? How do you communicate that? And I wonder, increasingly, as enmity gets worse, as society seems more fractured, as fighting seems to be more commonplace, not just in the political sphere, but increasingly outside it. I wonder if one of the best ways to explain and express common humanity is actually to come at it from the other end of the telescope and approach it from what could be loosely described as selfish rather than selfless. Because social justice is largely about selflessness. It is largely about doing things that won't be of immediate benefit to you personally, except to your soul, if you're religious, or perhaps to your conscience, if you're not, or even perhaps to a slightly self-congratulatory sense of having done the right thing. But what would happen if you didn't know where you were in society? So I've been reading a lot of John Rawls's work. John Rawls is a philosopher, an American philosopher, who was at his peak, I think, in the 70s. And he came out with something called the veil of ignorance. And the veil of ignorance is applied chiefly to a justice system, but I think it probably applies to everything else. And what Rawls argued was that if you didn't know where you sat on the ladder of society, but you were charged with approving of or disapproving of certain laws, then you would actually act in a much more equable fashion than if you knew, for example, that this law was going to persecute or oppress 80% of the population, but you were in the 20%, so by all means carry on, bring that law in, I'm going to be fine. I like this law, I'm in the 20%, I'm winning. But if you didn't know whether you were 20% or 80%, you'd be entertaining the possibility that if this law came in, you were going to be on the wrong end of it. You were going to be one of the people getting stamped on, you were going to be one of the people getting oppressed. So I wonder if that extends beyond law and moves instead into every area of public sphere, I wonder whether that's a way to reclaim these words, actually, from those who would have us think that being good, that trying to be good, is somehow bad. Because if you recognize the possibility that you might be a refugee in this society over which we've drawn the veil of ignorance, then the suggestion that we should leave refugees drowning in the sea probably wouldn't seem quite as attractive to you as it would if you had genuinely entertained the possibility of one day being one. And maybe not you, maybe just someone you love, someone you care for, maybe just someone you know. And if you extend this veil of ignorance into all other areas of life, then quite a lot of these phrases that have been rendered negative despite being fundamentally positive, they lose their bite, they lose their sting. Would you be opposed to multiculturalism if you didn't know what culture you belonged to while framing laws, while building society, while introducing institutions? If you effectively tried to teach and treat everybody the same, as being fundamentally equally deserving of dignity, compassion, and decency? Of course you would. But if you are building a society in full knowledge of where you sit in it, then you are, and plenty of people who fall for this snake oil, plenty of people who fall under the spell of latter-day demagogues are not bad people. The distinction between liars and people who have fallen for lies is probably the most crucial political challenge facing British and American society at the moment. They're not all bad people. But if you know where you are in society and someone encourages you to look down on others, to blame your problems on people less fortunate than yourself, on people recently arrived from other countries, on people who perhaps follow a different faith or no faith, if you're encouraged to blame your problems on them by people up there, you're a lot more likely to fall for it if you know where you sit in society. If we can build somehow a sense of commonality, a sense of unity, by recognizing, to use a phrase from my own religious background, that there, but for the grace of God, go I, then perhaps we all start being a little bit nicer to each other, a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more decent. We all perhaps start seeing a little bit more social justice in our lives. And I'm going to get a bit personal now, if I may, because I think that my own life and background has kind of given me a taste of what the veil of ignorance can do. Because I was adopted as a baby. I was 28 days old when I was adopted, and I've been blessed with the most magnificent parents, and I've never been remotely troubled or traumatized by that, as many adopted children can be in life. And I've been thinking about it a lot since becoming a dad, and I've been thinking about it a lot since watching my own country fall under the spell of people who think that human rights are bad, that social justice is hypocritical, that health and safety are things that we shouldn't fight for, that virtue signalling is somehow a sane position to adopt. I've been thinking a lot about my own life and why I feel about many things the same as the men and women behind Who is Hussein. And I think it's because I have, in the back of my mind, I have the kid who didn't get adopted. I have the kid who would have been born to a teenage mother in Ireland in 1972 and would have been raised probably in care, probably by some of these nuns and monks we've read about recently who would have inflicted, if I was lucky, they would have inflicted fairly horrible experiences upon me. I wouldn't have had a loving home. I wouldn't have had material comfort. I wouldn't have had parents who essentially dedicated their lives to my sister and I. I wouldn't have had the golden tickets that such parents are sometimes fortunate enough to be able to buy for their children. And I wouldn't have had the life that I've had. I wouldn't have my radio show either. That might be a good thing, I'm not sure. But when I think of that unadopted boy and I think about society, what I realize is that I would have been the recipient of more social justice, not the donor, not the architect, not the giver. And I think as we approach this very curious junction in Western history, when we see oppressive regimes rising, when we see people like Donald Trump achieving power and popularity while promising to exclude huge swathes of the population from his own country if he can, while defending some of the most unpleasant individuals and practices on an industrial scale, I wonder whether we all need to start recognizing that the boot could be on the other foot. However secure you think you are, however blessed you think you are, however lucky you think you are, if it was the other way round, how would you want everybody else to behave? That might be the way, just to start reclaiming these phrases and these ideas and these fundamental notions of goodness that underpin most religions, certainly the Abrahamic ones, and which absolutely underpin the story of Hussein. The idea that actually, if the cards had fallen slightly differently, I would need help, I would need support, I would need social justice. So, you know what? Maybe I am going to put my shoulder to the wheel. Maybe I am going to get involved in organizations like this one. Maybe I am going to start speaking up a bit more. Maybe I am going to start picking fights with the people who say you can't support refugees unless you've got 17 sleeping in your spare bedroom at the moment. Maybe I'm not going to just sit still, actually, as these powers gather pace, as these ancient hatreds rise, living in an era which historically is terrifying. We have a combination of an economic crisis and a refugee crisis combining to create atmospheres in Europe and America that allow the vilest of individuals to peddle the most horrible of doctrines to people who are so desperate that they will listen. And they will listen. So I wonder whether our job is not just to argue with the demagogues, not just to debate with the snake oil salesman, but actually through actions as much as words. I wonder whether our job now is to start drowning them out. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite, therefore, our third speaker, Sheikh Noor Mohammed, to address us. Sheikh Noor Mohammed is an inspiring Islamic scholar, speaker, and researcher. Originally from Ghana, he is the Minister for Religion at the Abbasi Islamic Center in Birmingham and an advocate for human rights and social equality. And he's appeared on news outlets such as the BBC. Please join me in welcoming our third and final speaker, Sheikh Noor Mohammed.
I begin in the name of Almighty God, who has given us this moment and this opportunity to be inspired by a personality like Hussein, the son of Ali. And I hope and pray that this inaugural conference will serve as a means of serious discussions on social justice at our homes, at our workplaces, and wherever we will find ourselves. And my task this evening, brothers and sisters, is to present to you Hussein, the son of Ali, as a universal figure and not a Muslim general. As someone that each and every one of us can be inspired by what he stood for. And to present to you why Hussein stands for me and why he will continue to stand for me so long as I live in this world. And to invite each and every one of you to spend few of your moments to take inspirations from Hussein, the son of Ali. And I want to begin by asking a very fundamental question. And I will humbly request brothers and sisters to think about this question. As we all sitting here tonight, we are of different religious denominations or different backgrounds. Some of us are Muslims, some of us are Christians, some of us are Hindus, some of us are Sikhs. From wherever you're coming from, it doesn't matter. There are things that you can learn from Hussein, the son of Ali. So the question is, what is the main objective of religion? Why religion? And if you like, what is the main objective of democratic institutions? I personally believe both religion and democratic institutions have same objective and aim. What is the aim? To establish social justice and nothing else. Islam is about social justice. Christianity is about social justice. It's about harmony. It's about living together. Democratic institutions are all about social justice. When we are told to uphold the constitutions of our countries, it's all about social justice. It's about presenting equal opportunities to people. Now, if our religions and our democratic institutions are to establish nothing but social justice, then the second question comes. What do we see around us? Do we see true social justice? That is why I said earlier on, we should not just come here, listen to the speeches, and go home and do nothing. This should serve as a beginning of serious discussions on important social justice matters. If all our religions and democratic institutions are to establish social justice, what do we see around dominating the world? You look around, be it Islamic societies or non-Islamic societies, it doesn't matter. Just look around. What is dominating the world? Greed. 2, lust. 3, hatred. 4, corruption. 5, oppression. 6, hunger, poverty. But our religions are to establish social justice. Our democratic institutions are to establish social justice. Why do we see hunger? Why do we experience hatred, whether Muslims or non-Muslims? The way we experience hatred, non-Muslims also experience it from different perspectives altogether. What is the missing link? Where have we gone wrong? Are we not Muslims? Are we not Christians? Are we not democratic? Where have we gone wrong? What is missing? In my candid opinion, a leader like Hussein is missing. A leader like Hussein. We may not have Hussein with us physically, but the values of Hussein will remain with us forever and ever. And if a leader like Hussein is hard to come by, we need personalities and leaders who are truly inspired by a leader like Hussein. Otherwise, the world will remain like that. Hence, it is important we understand what Hussein stood for. Those leaders who were inspired by Hussein, irrespective of their religious affiliations, brought changes not only to themselves, but to their people and communities. We heard of Gandhi. Gandhi explicitly mentioned, I learned from Hussein how to achieve victory, isn't it? We heard of Nelson Mandela. Is a world icon. I lived in South Africa for 9 years, and I know what Nelson Mandela did, and it's revered all over the world. Nelson Mandela explicitly mentioned how he was touched and inspired by Hussein. Charles Dickens, Edward Gibbon, they all spoke high of Hussein. So to me, the missing link is leadership like the leadership of Hussein, or personalities who are truly inspired by Hussein. Now, why Hussein? And why the leadership of Hussein? It's because of one thing. Just one thing. You know what is that? Hussein was absolutely selfless. That's it. Hussein was selfless. Hence, he taught us two things: how to die and how to live. That's it. He was selfless. So he taught us these two things: how to die and how to live. How did he teach us how to die? Hussein never showed fear in the face of absolute tyranny. And he was willing to sacrifice himself for nothing but social justice. He was willing. Who is willing to do that today? It's easier said than done. We need selfless leaders who are willing to sacrifice their valuables, not for anything but for social justice. And no one else did that perfectly like Hussein. And Hussein, he taught us. He said, I'm willing to sacrifice myself to ensure the survival of the legacy of my grandfather Muhammad. So there's a link between Hussein and Muhammad. Because Prophet Muhammad is supposed to have said, if you truly want to bring about change to a nation, then there are two things that are needed: selfless and sacrifice. And that is why Hussein made it very clear, I do not rise for evilness, and I do not rise for corruption, and I do not rise for oppression, but I leave Medina to bring about reformation in the nations of my grandfather. And I enjoy good and forbid evilness. That's what Hussein stood for. And number two, Hussein taught us how to live. You know why and how? When Hussein died and his son came to bury him, his son saw some bruises on the shoulders of Hussein. And he was asked, what is it? Because this is not new. This looks like it's been there for long. He said, yes, there are things you do not know about my father. My father used to carry sacks of food every night and he used to go around to poor people and widows and he used to distribute those food. That's how Hussein taught us how to live. So therefore, brothers and sisters, let's get inspired by the message of Hussein. And the world is in need of Hussein. And so therefore, thank you, Hussein. And I hope and pray this is the beginning of good things to happen. And people will begin to think seriously about social justice. Thank you so much. And may God bless you.
It was the night Mum had to bring the candles out. We could have sat under the stars, but the mantis was out. That's where we made playgrounds out of buildings broken. See, they adapted well, never really broke bones, but all these children were broken. Though inside they were burning, some thought process later, everybody smoking weed. We grew up together and by default we should be on the same team, so why are you fighting with me for? Most of us kids could have blown like a C4. But we just fight until we see 4 figures in our eyes, cause 4 figures ain't enough to survive. So you gotta be able to see before you see signs. Presented with contracts we ain't able to read, but everybody signed. I just let the devil in my life. What the hell did I do? I let the devil in my life. Now we won't spare my love. And we went through phases. I guess everything does. I remember sunny days and dark nights, but I guess everyone does. So my family looked at me bleeding like that's everyone's blood. I pick up papers on a train, I'm never surprised at the state of the world today. And there's some evil people in a world of pain, but I can't connect to you if I can't connect to my Wi-Fi. Wait, it says a Muslim man, why is his religion so important? And how does that man sleep with the thought of the girl that he raped? I hope she'll be a great mother one day. You see the image in his head, turned her father insane. They took her father away. He worked hard to get to where he is today and never contributed to another soul's pain, but then murder. Any man would have done the same. That's the girl who used to hear your bedtime stories, run into your arms as she found all the glory. So any man would, I ain't saying that you should, but where do we go from here? I told him throw the drugs away and only children fall in love with the rain until the puddles start to reflect a troubled filled face. And the light can only shine when there's nothing in the way. He was almost persuaded, but he couldn't pause, let alone quit the game. I realized I couldn't save him. Now I'm stood here reciting poetry. I'm beginning to feel like won't ever change things because I couldn't persuade him. So where do we go from here? Somewhere in the depths of your mind, these words were supposed to materialize, but they can't survive inside. So they die and we die inside. Why am I stood here telling stories that repeated themselves since back when Jesus of Nazareth came with a message that fell onto cold ears? I ain't a prophet though. I'm lower than low. But these rappers keep speaking about what it's like being high, making profit and dough. Plus it's beginning to seem like religious leaders just like being right. So how am I supposed to explain to my brother it's instructive to live what he likes living like? He told me he thinks religion is long. Yeah, he's young and he likes to have fun. What was I supposed to say? It's not like you don't believe in God. It's not like you don't know that it's wrong. I was speechless. How do we find square one? And where do we go from there, bruv? If we stay on this chessboard, I must be dreaming. These thoughts just drag on and spiral. Cause somewhere in between Spiral, the Dragon Days, and today we went down a long, wrong path into Silent Hill. All the residents are evil now. You were good-hearted, I remember. You were good-hearted, I remember. You used to give me salam before December. But now you walk with that religious crowd. Oh, you religious now. And you walk around putting sinners down, that's surprising. And you advocate hate between Shia, Sunni, Sufis and all different religions now. Even though you probably been to the other one's house and ate from his mother's plate, still refuse to understand the divide and conquer strategy of the states. But you religious now, right? Nothing changes though. Everybody changes. People change and it's always the same thing. Issues ain't addressing this community slave ship. Our community's fallen. We commune in a matrix and nobody's communicating, saying what's wrong. How do we generate change in a lost generation? Trying to generate change just to pay for the mistakes of creation at the mercy of desires on the brink of erasing all spiritual traces, but we go with the flow. Dark whispers, sick as anything you know. Twist and turn through the holes in our spirit and our souls. They make the leaves whistle their words outside in the night, but they lurk in our home, so where do we go? Where do we go? Thank you.
You'll be pleased to know I'm going to now invite onto the stage our first speaker, and I'm so very excited to have her with us today. Katrina Robertson is an interfaith and community activist. A graduate of St. Andrews University, she has worked with communities, churches, Islamic centres around the world. She co-founded the European Network on Religion and Belief and has been an advisor to the British Transport Police, convening as well the London Borough's Faith Network, which links local religious communities with government agencies. She's visited Pakistan several times and has also travelled extensively in North Africa and the Middle East. She's a regular speaker at faith-based, human rights and academic events and chairs the Women and Faith session at the Women of the World Festival at London's South Bank Centre. Her writing appears online and in books. She also advises on matters relating to poverty and exclusion in India and on the environment in the South Pacific. She currently serves as the director of the Christian Muslim Forum, and as someone who knows her personally, I can only say that the only thing bigger than her biography is her kindness of spirit and her heart. Please join me in welcoming with a loud round of applause Katrina Robertson to the stage.
Thank you very much, Ali, for your very warm welcome, and I'm delighted to be here. Look at all these people with a fantastic crowd and a crowd of people inspired by Hussein's life and his principled stand against injustice. He took action. And as we've heard, the global network of Who is Hussein inspires people to take action. And I know each of you is active in a huge variety of ways. So I've chosen 3 examples of taking action for social justice that I've been closely involved in. And each one has brought people from different communities together to play their part in making a positive difference. And the first is mental health. And in particular, the challenging the persistent health inequalities that make Londoners from minority ethnic backgrounds far more likely, and I'm sure you know the statistics on this probably better than I do, to suffer serious mental illness than everyone else. So mental health services often fail to reach the people that need them until far too late, when hospitalisation is the only option, and we all know what an awful trauma that is. But we also know that for people from minority groups, their religious communities, their Islamic centres, churches, temples, are often the first port of call when trouble hits or when life gets tough, because that's where people feel they're known, they're trusted, where they can tell their story and where they're going to get help. So a local group in one of the London boroughs has brought the clinicians, the counsellors and the psychotherapists from the Mental Health Trust and the places of worship, the leaders of the places of worship together, so that they actually know one another and to sort of close that gap and to build some trust between them instead of a bit of a standoff. So pastors and imams have had training in systemic family therapy so that when people come to see them, it could be some pastoral matter or some spiritual matter, that they are, with this training, they're able to spot when there's just something else going on there and when they think that a bit of professional help might be just the thing and stop things getting much worse. And because they know the clinicians and they have a relationship with them and they can trust them, then they can refer those people directly instead of saying to that person, perhaps you better see your GP, or perhaps download this app and beat the blues or whatever it is. They've got that personal relationship, and so that person can get the help they need as soon as they need it, rather than waiting until it gets much, much worse. So instead of viewing local places of worship as a bit odd and probably part of the problem, the local mental health services are now working to close that gap and see the public they serve as partners in supporting good mental health. And in all this, it's kind of a structural thing. It takes a long time. We need to be smart and savvy rather than naive and simplistic. It's a long game, and it takes time to move through all those processes. But when it works, it is absolutely fantastic. And we all know from the statistics in London that we do need much, much better mental health and support for people who are suffering anxiety and depression, and particularly young people. My second example concerns resilience. How do we, as religious communities, as citizens, as social networks, respond to major emergencies in London? For instance, if the River Thames flooded badly, it might not get quite as far as here, but certainly in central London, it would be a bit of a disaster. If a flu pandemic paralysed the city, causing thousands of deaths, how would we cope when there were too many bodies to cremate or to bury or to deal with? How would we manage that? Or what if the electricity failed for 4 or 5 days, knocking out public transport, lifts, water supplies, even sanitation? And perhaps, as somebody who's on their mobile 24/7 pretty much, how would we cope without our mobiles if the electricity was off and we couldn't recharge? Who could we trust to tell us what was happening? And what should we do? So, with all these big emergencies, there are plans in place, and there are the emergency services all set up to help us. But how could we, as ordinary citizens and as members of religious communities, work with those emergency services to make sure the vulnerable weren't forgotten? So people at the top of tower blocks, the housebound, the elderly, the young people. Well, London Borough's Faith Network is training key people in each place of worship in London, connecting them with the emergency planners, with the police, the emergency services, making sure there are proper and reliable relationships between the people who we need to be in touch with if an emergency happens. So not just a name on a list. In this way, religious communities are not part of the problem, they're certainly part of the solution. And I know that some of you people here were involved in the aftermath after the Grenfell fire. And yes, putting the fire out was essential. Yes, that immediate relief. And I know people were so generous, providing shelter and clothing and water and food, and caring for the grief-stricken survivors. But we also need to ask, if we're concerned about social justice, how could this happen in London in 2017? What combination of factors resulted in such shocking loss of life? And if you're skilled, and I'm sure some of you here are, if you're skilled in law, in anthropology, in finance, in public policy, in architecture, in business, in political life, in the arts, what can we learn from the Grenfell fire? And how can we make sure it can't possibly happen again? The joining up people of goodwill, like yourselves, with the structures and decision-making apparatus and with the relevant expertise can make a huge long-term contribution to social justice. My third example and last is from the interfaith world, from the Christian Muslim Forum. We, apart from a lot of project work, we have a core group of Christians and Muslims, men and women from different backgrounds and with different views, very different views. Sometimes you think, you wonder how they are going to be able to sit in the same room together, but they do. And we listen to each other on topics of concern, but we're not just listening to the views. We can do that by reading somebody's blog or reading a long-form piece. We want to understand why that person thinks the way they do, what lies behind the opinion, what experiences or background have led to this. And in this way, we get to know people as people, and not just as holders of diverse opinions. We can understand each other better and are able to take that understanding back to our own communities so that they can understand better too. And in the current context, this is not easy work. Those of you who tried this kind of thing, it's hard. The conversations are quite raw, but we are committed to speaking honestly and to listening to each other and bridging these divides. Here are some of the hot topics we've identified. Media, free speech and public debate. Where does legitimate criticism of religion blur into ridicule, bigotry and xenophobia? Because we're all in favour of free speech and in public debate, and we're all against ridicule, bigotry and xenophobia, but people have different ideas of where the marker is on that. And it's a hot topic where people certainly have very different views. Anti-Muslim hate crime. And we're all very shocked by what happened at the Husseini Centre in Cricklewood last week. Attacks on mosques have doubled in the past year. And we've had the despicable Punish a Muslim Day letter. And the Christian Muslim Forum is determined to challenge complacency on this. Thirdly, the rise of the far right, the intimidation of Muslims in the name of Christianity, the kind of people you see pictures of on a high street demonstration holding a big white cross. To challenge that, and in the same way to challenge the horrible stuff that takes place in the name of Islam. So extremism, terrorism, and the Prevent programme, these are all tricky issues to talk about. And we're all, Christians and Muslims, very concerned about this. And of course the attacks last year, Westminster Bridge, Manchester, London Bridge, Finsbury Park, have only served to strengthen the determination to work together on it. But it is a tough environment at the moment. It's a highly politicised climate, and it's more polarised, and I'm sure you've experienced yourselves. And there are struggles over definitions. There are deep-seated differences and a lack of commitment sometimes to engage across divisions. People just prefer to just withdraw and not have those conversations. It's just too difficult. So there is a lot of excellent work taking place, including the Christian Muslim Forum's own church mosque twinning and many other programmes. But the context in which it takes place is not as positive as it once was. In closing, I'd like to add this. In our social justice work, particularly when working with people who are different from us or who hold views that challenge us, we can be generous. I wonder, when you think about it, how have you made changes to your life? Often it's the people who are kind to us, who try to understand us, who are the ones who open up new ways of thinking, who give us the energy to tackle something hard. The President of the United States in the 60s, J.F. Kennedy, in a speech about reasons for space exploration said, and some of you will be familiar with this quote, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, accomplishments and aspirations, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organise and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win." So in other words, we won't become the best we can be by taking the easy option. And being ambitious in this way, it's good to remind ourselves not to be afraid to fail. Not everything we try out will succeed. We learn a lot from failing. Tackling the difficult stuff is always going to be hard. We remember the words of Samuel Beckett. Ever tried? Ever failed? No matter. Try again. Fail again. Fail better. But let's not forget the simple, everyday stuff as well. In this busy city of over 8 million, loneliness is common, and there are all kinds of reasons why people might be feeling out of sorts. So on the tube, at work, in the gym, in the cafe, at home. Just a smile, a helping hand, a sympathetic glance at the right time can make all the difference. Social justice is a living, breathing way of life. It's inspiring to be here with you today. Who is Hussein provides a great place to learn, to encourage, to pool resources and ideas and to take action together. Ali, I'm sure, will keep me in the loop with all that you plan, and if there's anything that I or the Christian Muslim Forum can do to support you in your social justice work, you know where to find me. Thank you.